Good evening. Hello, everyone. I think we've got some people on this side maybe, but maybe they're coming. I'm Beth McNeil, and I have the real pleasure, to serve as the Dean of the Libraries and School of Information Studies. My glasses are fogging, so I'll put this on in just a minute. I'm also the Esther Ellis Norton Professor of Library Science. Thank you so much for joining us tonight here in the Virginia Kelly Carnes Archives and Special Collections Research Center. It's a mouthful, but to see and celebrate our new exhibition, Not Given But Earned, Women's Fight for the Vote. This exhibit, as many of you have seen, includes rare books, original records, artifacts that document key people and important aspects of the women's suffrage movement. The mission of the Purdue Archives and Special Collections, which is a division of the libraries, is to support the discovery, learning, and engagement goals of Purdue by identifying, collecting, preserving, and making available for research the records and papers of enduring value, created or received by a university and its employees. Our archivists and staff, many of whom are here today, tackle all aspects of this important work each and every day, identifying new collections, and increasingly these days, new collections from voices not previously heard, filling in gaps in our history, building relationships with individuals with collections to share, hearing their stories, and preserving these materials for the future, for future students, for researchers, for community members, and others around the world. During a non-COVID year, so maybe in the old days, a typical year, 2,000 to 3,000 visitors come into Archives and Special Collections, and that's not counting the 25,000 to 35,000 online visitors to the website in the collections. Why do they come? Well, they come to see and use, to study and do research with our collections. And in addition to identifying, collecting, and preserving these collections, our archivists and staff make them available. And it's the making available aspect of their work in special collections and their mission that brings us together tonight. Not Given But Earned, Women's Fight for the Vote tells the stories of Purdue women and Hoosier, I still struggle with that word, Hoosier women, who contributed to the suffrage effort and how women and others continued, and in fact continue today, to push for equitable rights. It's a terrific exhibit. And if you haven't had a chance to really dig into it tonight, I urge you to stick around or come back again. The exhibit will be up for a while longer. I'm not an archivist by training, but I've worked with many archivists over the years, and I've learned a small bit of what they do. Putting an exhibit like this together can be a year or more in the making. Much research goes into it, choosing what to include, choosing what not to include, what best represents the topic, what to highlight from various collections, and many people can be involved. So kudos to our archive staff, particularly Katey, who will be speaking next, for all their hard work. And I'll go ahead and actually talk about the thank yous that are necessary. First of all, to Katey Watson, the France A. Córdova Archivist and Curator for this exhibit. I also want to acknowledge the students who assisted Katey, and I'm not sure if they're here tonight, but Virginia Pleasant and Emily Sangren were graduate assistants. Are they here? No. And our undergraduate student, Megan Garrett. And then, of course, to the dedicated members of the Archives Division who helped Katey by recommending collections, answering questions, and doing anything else it took to make this exhibit possible. Tiffany, Craig, Adriana, Stephanie, Neil, Rich, Maureen, and of course, Sammy Morris, our head of Archives and Special Collections. A big thank you. And actually, I'd like you to join me. Many of them are here this evening. Thank you, too, to our excellent marketing and communication staff, Director Phil Kolb, who is here or was here, might be picking up a kid from basketball. Oh, there's Phil. And to Ann Reinecke in his office for the designs for the banner and the graphics for the exhibit. And finally, a thank you to our Purdue for Life Foundation staff, several of who are here tonight, who helped to make this event possible. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Katey Watson, the France A. Córdova Archivist and Curator for the exhibit, for her remarks. Katey Watson joined us in January of 2019, just before the pandemic. She's worked in archives, museums, and the library field since 2010, has a master's degree in archives and records management and book history and print culture. And I think if that's one degree, that's quite a handful. from the University of Toronto and an Honors Bachelor of Arts, History and English from York University. We're fortunate to have Katey Watson here with us in the libraries and archives, and I'm grateful to all of you for being here tonight. Please join me in welcoming Katey to the platform.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming to the reception to commemorate the opening of our women's suffrage exhibition, Not Given But Earned, Women's Fight for the Vote. As Beth already introduced me, my name's Katey Watson. I'm the Córdova Archivist here, and I manage the women's collections here at the Purdue University Archives and Special Collections. So this exhibition was initially intended to coincide with the centennial of the passage of the 19th Amendment in 2020. As we know all too well, the universe had other plans. So we ended up opening the exhibition 1 year later, commemorating the 101st anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment. And we actually specifically chose to open the exhibition in August of this year, not just for the start of fall semester, but also because the 19th Amendment was officially adopted into the U.S. Constitution and certified on August 26. So the topic for this exhibit was originally suggested by the League of Women Voters of Greater Lafayette, who join us today, and whose organization has roots in the suffrage movement and continues to advocate for voting rights even today. When they first suggested this topic, we weren't sure that we would actually have enough content in order to tell the story of women's suffrage, let alone how Hoosier and Purdue women were involved in the movement. We really only knew of one small collection of papers from an early Hoosier suffragist and the organizational records from the League. Outside of those papers, we really didn't know how much more we had. However, after a lot of research and digging through our collections, we found that we had numerous rare books, pamphlets, articles, and more papers than expected about early suffragists, women's rights discussions, voting rights, and that Purdue students, faculty, and staff had integrated themselves into the movement. Some of the most interesting and unexpected materials that we found in doing our research include a first edition of Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Women, which was published in 1792 and is considered to be one of the first feminist texts. Early pamphlets documenting women's rights discussions happening in other countries, such as Great Britain and Spain. Original drawings by John T. McCutcheon, a Purdue alumni from 1889, depicting key events in the suffrage movement, and which were published in the Chicago Tribune at the time. Letters and speeches by early Hoosier suffragists, such as Paulina Merritt, who lobbied politicians to support women's suffrage, Helen Gauger, who argued for women's right to vote in front of the Indiana Supreme Court, and May Wright Sewell, who was a close ally of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and an internationally recognized suffragist. We also found mentions in the Debris Yearbook describing students as suffragists and articles in the Purdue Exponent about a student suffrage organization organized here on campus, as well as student plays being put on about the suffrage movement at the time. We learned about Anna Kelton Wiley, Dr. Harvey Wiley's wife, who was arrested in 1917 for picketing the White House in support of the 19th Amendment. And we also located a manuscript from Helen Bass Williams, the first Black professor here at Purdue University and an activist in the civil rights movement, about her efforts to help Black voters register to vote in Mississippi and how polling stations were moved sometimes multiple times a day to suppress Black voters. And of course, so many pamphlets, buttons, articles, and more about the continued activism of suffragists who, after the passage of the 19th Amendment, went on to educate newly enfranchised women and to advocate for the Equal Rights Amendment, including papers from Amelia Earhart, who, along with members of the National Women's Party, petitioned President Hoover to support the ERA. These examples are just a snapshot of some of the rare and original materials from the archives collections that are on display in this exhibition. As Beth mentioned, the exhibition does not intend to retell the entire story of the suffrage movement. It really intends to situate Hoosier and Purdue women within the wider national and international movement, highlight their actions and contributions, discuss the inequalities that persisted throughout the movement and even after the passage of the 19th Amendment, and to show how women and many other groups continue to advocate for equitable rights. So, though I'm the one up here talking, this exhibit, as all exhibits are always a team effort, and really couldn't have been done without our students here at Purdue, in the Purdue Archives. Beth mentioned them before, but I'll tell you a bit about what they did. So one of our former graduate students, Virginia Pleasant, helped locate many of the materials that you see in the exhibit, and also helped research and identify many of the women who are mentioned as well. One of our current graduate students, Emily Sandgren, designed and built some of the custom mounts that you'll see that were used to actually safely display the items in the exhibit. And then Emily, along with one of our undergraduate students, Megan Garrett, helped to physically install the exhibit, which can take a long time and takes an awful lot of work. And of course, we have such a great team here at the Archives. All of the Archives staff had a hand in helping create this exhibit, whether it was through alerting the exhibit team to collections that they had come across related to women's suffrage, answering the million questions we had about installing an exhibit, and really just being willing to kind of help us in any way that we needed. And our marketing team, who helped design the beautiful graphics, who created the magnets and buttons that you saw at the registration table, and I hope you picked up, and who really orchestrated this whole event. So I hope that you enjoy the exhibit and the delicious food that we have. And once again, I want to thank everyone for coming out to support the Purdue Libraries and the Purdue Archives. Now I'd like to welcome our next and final speaker to represent our co-sponsors for this event, Barb Clark, the Executive for Business for the League of Women Voters of Greater Lafayette. Please join me in thanking the League for their contributions in co-sponsoring this event, and let's welcome our next speaker.
Thank you, Katey, for the introduction and for all the work you've done to prepare this exhibit. And I'd also like to acknowledge Beth for the great work she does for the Purdue Libraries. Also, I would like to give a special thanks to Kathy Potter and Jean Andrus from the League, who provided assistance to Katey on pre-exhibition research. Good evening. I'm Barbara Clark, Executive for Business of the League of Women Voters of Greater Lafayette. The League is honored to be a part of tonight's event that focuses on women's suffrage movement in our community and across the state of Indiana through the exhibition, Not Given But Earned, Women's Fight for the Vote. We are grateful to the Virginia Kelly Carnes Archives and Special Collections of Purdue University for giving us the opportunity to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment that gave women the right to vote in 1920. 1920 was an important year for the League of Women Voters, too. On February 14, 1920, 6 months before ratification of the 19th Amendment, the National League was organized in Chicago. And on April 30th, 1920, 4 months prior to the ratification, the Tippecanoe County League of Women Voters was founded. We owe our founding not only to the National American Women's Suffrage Association, but also to the Lafayette Franchise League, born in 1912. As one of many throughout the state under the Women's Franchise Leagues of Indiana, headquartered in Peru, Indiana, I'll have more on that later. In the 8 years of its existence, the Lafayette Franchise League attained almost 500 members, after a modest start of only 21 charter members. The primary goal of the Women's Franchise League of Indiana was to honor Hoosier women and allies in order to give the women's voting rights, women voting rights at the state level. When this failed to occur, Hoosier suffragettes and allies focused on a federal amendment to grant them the right to vote. Upon its passage, a new goal was set by a new organization, the League of Women Voters, to foster education in citizenship and supporting improved legislation. This encompassed teaching women the mechanics of registration and voting, as well as something about the process of nomination, election procedure, and the American form of government. Our first president was Mrs. Thomas Arthur Stewart. Stewart is a familiar Lafayette name, and she would serve in that role for 10 years. At her first meeting, she declared that the League of Women Voters is a broader, larger, and greater organization than the Franchise League ever could have become. And it is, of course, absolutely nonpartisan. It is educational and legislative and concerned with everything good affecting women and the home. Quickly, back to Peru, Indiana. It was Mrs. Stewart's daughter, Marie Stewart Edwards, who was a major leader of the Women's Suffrage Association and the Franchise League nationally as well as in Indiana. She would help found the National League in 1920, then go on to serve as its treasurer and vice president. This last August, the city of Peru unveiled a life-size bronze statue of this prominent resident showing Marie as a 12-year-old girl with her beloved bike in Lafayette, where she grew up in the Stewart home known as Elmhurst. Gretchen Bertolette and I were fortunate enough to be in attendance at that event. The League of Women Voters of Greater Lafayette's archives are housed here in the Purdue Archives. Our research into these holdings indicate that another relationship between the League and the university in April 1923 was begun as an annual fall citizenship school with Purdue, and in 1924, the National League president, Carrie Chapman Catt, came to West Lafayette to instruct those classes. Throughout the years, our League's attention has remained on voter education and supportive legislation that corresponds to our programs at the local, state, and national levels. In the 1930s, Greater Lafayette's League began to study and act at the municipal level and address such issues as city planning, education financing, recreational facilities, and a new library for West Lafayette, and public welfare. And to illustrate how forward-thinking our League was, in the 1930s, concern was expressed about the effect movies have on children, stating that the characters on the screen are very real to them, and naturally, they are impressed by the things that they see and hear at a movie production. To encapsulate here all of the accomplishments of the League of Women Voters of Greater Lafayette is not possible, but last year we had planned to celebrate our centennial via a variety of events and activities. One of those activities was to ask longtime members to jot down a few thoughts about their League experience. Eleanor Riggs wrote, "When I was visiting Indianapolis, I heard a speech by the state president of the League of Women Voters. I was inspired and thought, this is what I want to be involved with. We moved here in 1963, and I have been a member my whole life. In those days, we had 4 to 5 discussion groups in order to reach consensus. That's what I like about the League, nonpartisan and coming to consensus. Today, our efforts nationally, statewide, and locally continue to benefit women and men through the major public policy issues and influencing public policy through education and advocacy. The League of Women Voters was formed to help 20 million women carry out their new responsibilities as voters, and we continue to promote informed citizens' participation at all levels of government in order to create a more perfect democracy for all." And now I'd like to invite everyone to move to the exhibit if you haven't already seen it and enjoy it. Thank you.